But there is concern that China is building up significant overcapacity.
China is now simply too large for the rest of the world to absorb this enormous capacity.
There is a race right now, and this is admitted by the mainstream media, a race, a competition between Biden and Trump on who can argue they will put the most tariffs on China. Who can create the most dumbassery against China? So Biden says he's going to create 25% tariffs, and then Trump says, I'm going to do 50% tariffs, and then Biden says, oh, I'm doing 100% tariffs. And there's an absolute fight between the two of them on who can be more terrified of China. Did you get it? Did you get it? You come here for the puns, right? They're both terrified. All right, I'm done. Biden hits, this is from New York Times, Biden hits Chinese electric vehicles, chips, and other goods with higher tariffs. Trump is claiming that Biden got this idea from him, that nobody was increasing tariffs on China till Trump decided to do it. Now, of course, there's a lot of economic reasons that the U.S. hates China. Many of them I've gone through before. But in terms of this specific moment of tariffs on electric vehicles, and the U.S. using the term overcapacity over and over again, that's their new word. Here's my article about it. Wall Street Journal had a blaring headline recently saying China's overcapacity is already backfiring. Oh my God. I wonder how bad it is for China, right? You read that headline, you go, well, shit, China's screwed. It's already backfiring. I don't know what overcapacity is or what backfiring means, but I bet I'm about to find out. And so then you look at the second sentence of that Wall Street Journal article, and it says, quote, China's first quarter growth beat most estimates, rising 5.3% on the year. So by backfiring, they meant China's doing better than expected. Wall Street Journal, all of our mainstream media now know that most people only read the headlines. Like, I don't know what the percentages are, but I bet you it's 75% of people that read a headline don't read the article, either because they decide they're not interested. They still took in the headline, so they've still got that. But it's either because they're not interested or because they think, well, I got it from the headline. I don't need to. I learned enough. Their overcapacity is backfiring. Done. They will give headlines that don't match the article because the headline is the actual propaganda. That's it. That's all they needed. But if you actually read the second sentence of the article, Wall Street Journal says China's doing better than expected. Which I don't like. How are you a journalist and you're okay with writing that shit? Just like writing the opposite of the headline in the article. It's amazing to me. When U.S. officials say that China has an overcapacity problem, they aren't referring to all things China produces. They keep saying, and this has been something several officials have said. It's in several headlines. U.S. says overcapacity. Janet Yellen went there, said overcapacity. But it's not about all things, right? Because if you're like me, and you live in the United States, or probably other countries like Canada and stuff too, but especially the United States, you know that just about everything we have is built in China. It's all made in China. All right. If you walk through your house or apartment, you will see your clothes made in China, your dog toys made in China, your shower curtains made in China, your boots, the little Halloween costumes that you put on your cat that she really hates, but you love. You put them on even when it's not Halloween. All made in China. Everything's made in China. Your cat's probably made in China. Everything's made in China. If the U.S. is accusing China of overcapacity, you would assume they're accusing them of overcapacity on everything, right? But no. There's a very specific group of things that the U.S. is saying China's overcapacity on. U.S. officials are only concerned about a very specific group of things. As Reuters reported in her visit to China, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen chastised, quote, China over excess industrial capacity on, here's the list, electric vehicles, EVs, solar panels, and batteries. Those three things are the only things that China's producing too many of. I wonder why those three things, why are those the things that the U.S. is upset about? What do those three things have in common? Well, they're all used to get off fossil fuels, right? The batteries that make your electric car work and your electric anything work, electric vehicles in general, solar panels, These are the keys to getting off fossil fuels, to stemming climate change, and to thereby having a future for our children and our grandchildren that doesn't consist of floating down a street on a mattress your whole life. All those things have to do with getting out of fossil fuels. You would assume that if they're accusing Chinese of making too many electric vehicles, then, well, I guess those electric vehicles must be awful, right? They must be cheap and crappy, right? The Americans must not want to buy them because they're so bad. They must have just wooden boards hanging off and the airbags that just go off whenever you stop at a red light, and radios that only play John Mayer, right? They must just be awful. Actually, no. Even U.S. propaganda outlet The Atlantic is, literally just does U.S. foreign policy propaganda. Even they said, quote, Chinese electric vehicles, cheap, stylish, and high quality, should be a godsend to the Biden administration. Instead, the White House is going out of its way to keep Chinese EVs out of the U.S. So clearly, the White House is afraid that seeing something high quality would be a shock to the American public, right? That must be the real reason. We wouldn't do well if we had to face something high quality. We're used to our bridges collapsing and our planes just blowing their doors out mid-flight and our trains derailing and exploding and causing entire towns to be toxic like East Palestine, Ohio. Seeing something work correctly would be confusing to your average American, wouldn't it? Why is it the U.S. government doesn't want cheap, high-quality EVs, solar panels, and batteries in the U.S.? So here's the secret. And those of you who are regular watchers of this show, it won't be much of a secret to you, but the U.S. economy and the U.S. dollar are entirely based on fossil fuels. Entirely based on fossil fuels. The U.S. dollar has its power for two reasons: because it's the reserve currency of the world, and because of the petrodollar. Fossil fuel, petroleum, sold and bought in U.S. dollars. Now, those two reasons. So you take away one, and then, and a middle finger is appropriate, you take away one, and then you only have one reason left. But here's the thing. You take away the petrodollar thing, and the reserve currency goes away, because the reason it's the reserve currency is because it's the petrodollar. If the U.S. is no longer the petrodollar, or petroleum is no longer sold and bought much, then the U.S. dollar is no longer the reserve currency, and then U.S. dollars cannot be printed endlessly. There's estimates that the U.S. dollar would immediately lose at minimum 27%, but perhaps as much as 50% of its power immediately, and that's just to start with. But on top of that, the U.S. government couldn't just print $1 trillion for the military every year. It would be a completely different game. The U.S. would be on par with all the other nations. And so the U.S. does not want to get off fossil fuels. It does not want cheap, reliable solar panels, EVs, and batteries available, because it destroys the petrodollar. As I say in the article, if fossil fuels stop being gobbled up due to high-quality EVs and efficient solar panels and high-tech batteries, then the U.S. dollar goes like a balloon when you untie it. And that's a technical term, all right? They have it in economics textbooks. This means the U.S. finds anything that is causing oil dollar sales to decrease to be dangerous to U.S. global rule. For example, one thing the U.S. would find dangerous, would find terrifying. In 2023 alone, China added more solar panels than the U.S. did in our nation's history. And that's coming from, I think, the New York Times. So why would China do such a thing, right? Why would China decide to have this overcapacity to ship so many cheap, reliable, awesome EVs and solar panels to the U.S.? And, okay, I'm going to read you this next quote. And I want you to try and guess which Chinese propaganda outlet printed this quote. Here's the quote. China's leaders have their own calculations, which prioritize stability decades from now over shareholder returns today. They're prioritizing the stability of their country and their people for decades over just profit today. To continue from the quote, it is crucial for Americans to recognize that for most of the world, perhaps for all of us, China's ability to provide low-cost green technology is, on balance, great news, unquote. Which Chinese propaganda outlet was that? That quote is actually from the New York Times. The New York Times, even they occasionally acknowledge that getting off fossil fuels is great for the world, and China's green technologies are not something to be feared, but instead something to be celebrated. To get back to the overcapacity issue for a minute, it's also claiming everything's overcapacity is a beautiful way for the US and Europe to blame their economic woes on China. Europe is struggling immensely. The US, of course, although we claim we're doing better and better, the US, the 2/3 of all Americans live paycheck to paycheck. Almost 2/3 of Americans can't afford a house. The US is not doing well, but Europe is struggling a lot. Energy costs have skyrocketed in Europe. So the overcapacity thing is also a good way for Europe to blame their economic woes on China. But let's be honest, Europe is not suffering right now because China made too many cheap, highly efficient, planet-saving cars and solar panels. Europe is in trouble because the US-backed proxy war in Ukraine has destroyed their energy market, has destroyed their economies, and we also blew up 3 out of 4 of their most important pipelines, the Nord Stream pipelines. That's why Europe's economies are struggling. One of the biggest reasons they're struggling. That is the truth behind why so many American officials, including Treasury Secretary, Biden administration, et cetera, are saying China's over capacity. They're just giving us too many awesome cheap EV cars. Those bastards. And I have not heard anybody else giving this take on it. I don't doubt that others also understand these facts, but I just haven't seen anybody else talking about it in this way. And, you know, it's critical in the time of climate crisis, as so many are dying from various natural disasters around the world that are obviously speeding up and becoming more dramatic as you have hundreds of millions of climate refugees already. You have climate refugees within the United States, people moving out of towns that are a little too fiery. Canada right now, the forest fires are very bad, and that is ruining the air quality, slowly ruining the air quality in parts of Canada, and it's moving into Michigan and Minnesota. And, you know, last year here in Baltimore, we couldn't go outside for several days because of the horrible toxic air coming down from Canada. So, yeah, we're all going to be climate refugees soon. And yet the U.S. is doing everything they can to make sure we stay on fossil fuels because the US dollar depends on it. And it's amazing this aspect of it doesn't get discussed more often.